Suppose you're standing in a quiet corner of a late-night diner, an onlooker to a world that usually ignores you. You're Zuri Imani, and your life is governed by the sovereign masters of rent and hunger. Suddenly, the brakes of reality fail. A car screeches outside, and armed men storm the room. Their target is Han Tae-woo, a man whose controlled power usually keeps him miles above the petty quibbles of the street. The hitmen raise their weapons, and a hurtling blade or bullet is inches from Tae-woo's chest. You have 2 seconds. Do you duck behind the counter to save yourself, or do you step in front of the runaway threat for a complete stranger? Most of us would say self-preservation is the only moral logic. We think it's better to stay hidden so we don't become the one who dies. But Zuri doesn't calculate the numbers or check his status. She makes an active choice to become involved in a situation she could have escaped. She grips a broken bottle like a pretty toy, turned deadly weapon, and throws herself into the path of the terrible wreck. It is a split-second act of categorical bravery that defies every rule of the city. As the blade finds a different mark, the familiar turns strange, and the story of Han Tae-woo begins to change, not because of a new law, but because of a debt he never thought he would owe. To understand the bravery of the active choice Zuri eventually makes, one must first understand the familiar and unquestioned setting of her everyday life. She lives in a world governed by 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, though for her, the master of pain, in the form of rent and hunger, is the one that speaks loudest. Every morning, Zuri Imani navigates the city as an onlooker to a prosperity she serves but never shares. She is the invisible girl, a figure who exists on the margins of society's utilitarian calculations. In the diner, she is not a person with a story, but a function, a provider of coffee and comfort whose own intrinsic quality is overlooked by those who see her only as a tool for their own convenience. Her existence is a series of practical questions regarding survival. She moves through her shifts with a playfulness and sobriety that masks a deeper exhaustion, knowing that her welfare is rarely a factor in the collective happiness of the city. Like the cabin boy Richard Parker, Zuri is essentially alone, an orphan in a social structure that values many other blessings, like livelihood and reputation, blessings she has never known. She is distanced from conventions and established assumptions because she has to be. She lives the answer to the question of what it means to be helpless in the face of a system that hurtles forward like a runaway trolley. In this unquestioned setting, Zuri has learned to acquiesce to her invisibility. She watches people like Han Tae-woo from a distance, recognizing them as the models of accomplishment that the world admires, while she remains a petty quibble in the grand design of the city's commerce. There is no lottery for her, no fair procedure that promises her a seat at the table of the powerful. She simply exists, a handful of a person whose life, by consequentialist logic, might seem to carry less weight than the giants of industry and crime she serves. Yet, it is this very status as the weakest that makes her coming transformation so riveting. Before the terrible wreck of the ambush, she is a soul in a resting place of routine, unaware that the restlessness of reason is about to wake her, and the man she saves, to a new way of seeing what a human life is truly worth. The quiet rhythm of the late-night shift, the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of a passing ambulance served as the unquestioned setting for Zuri's evening. It was a scene of playfulness and sobriety, where the clink of silverware felt like a permanent, settled belief. But in an instant, the brakes fail on this peaceful reality. The heavy glass doors of the diner don't just open, they shatter inward as the terrible wreck of an ambush begins. 4 men storm the entrance, their movements hurtling with a violent, singular purpose. They are not there for the meager contents of the cash register, they are there for Han Tae-woo. In that split second, the atmosphere of the diner shifts from a sanctuary of routine to a desperate theater of life and death. Tae-woo, usually the master of controlled power, finds himself helpless as the first shot rings out, the sound echoing like the shattering of a moral world. He is no longer the untouchable boss, he is a man whose brakes don't work, careening toward an end he cannot stop. The patrons scramble, driven by the sovereign masters of fear and self-preservation, seeking the resting place of the floor or the shadows. They are onlookers to a tragedy, paralyzed by the skepticism that anything can be done to alter the outcome. The hitmen closed the distance with the cold efficiency of consequentialist logic. To them, Taewoo is merely a target whose removal will bring about a desired state of the world for their employers. Amidst the chaos, Zuri Imani stands at the center of the track. While the rest of the world ducks, she feels the restlessness of reason, sparking a sudden, active choice. She sees the intrinsic quality of the moment, not as a petty quibble of gang warfare, but as a categorical emergency where a human life is about to be extinguished. As the lead assassin raises his weapon for a final, gruesome act, the invisible girl decides to become visible. She doesn't wait for a lottery or due process, she moves with a brave answer to the violence unfolding before her, stepping into the runaway path of the killers to challenge the mentality that justifies such a slaughter. The familiar diner has turned a strange and lethal, and in this tragic circumstance, Zuri prepares to throw the steering wheel of fate in a direction no one, least of all Han Tae-woo, ever expected. In that fraction of a second, the trolley car of violence reached its point of no return. As the lead hitman leveled his weapon at Han Tae-woo, the sovereign masters of the street, fear and cold utility, dictated that Zuri should stay down. To intervene was to choose an actual act of involvement in a situation she had otherwise escaped. But Zuri Imani did not retreat into the evasion of skepticism. She didn't pause to weigh whether one life was worth more than another or if Taewoo's excellent character or lack thereof justified his survival. Driven by a categorical impulse that located morality not in the consequences, but in the intrinsic quality of the act itself, she reached for the only tool within her grasp, a glass bottle from the counter. With a split-second choice that mirrored the driver reaching for the steering wheel, she shattered the glass against the edge of a table. The sound was a sharp, riveting crack that momentarily stalled the hurtling momentum of the killers. She didn't just watch, she became an active participant. With her natural hair slightly messy and a visible cut, already opening on her forehead from flying debris, she threw herself over the injured Taewoo. Gripping the broken bottle like a weapon, she stood as a human shield between the controlled power of the Mafia boss and the gruesome bounty the hitmen sought to collect. Her expression, Taewoo looked up from the floor, his shock and disbelief evident as he saw his white shirt beginning to stain with her blood. He was the onlooker now, witnessing a transformation of the social order he thought he understood. Zuri wasn't acting out of a verbal contract or a lottery that forced her hand. This was a consent in its purest, most admirable form, a voluntary sacrifice for a man who had never even looked her in the eye. In this terrible trolley car wreck of a moment, the invisible waitress had awakened the restlessness of reason in a man who thought he was untouchable. She wasn't just saving a life, she was estranging him from his familiar world of petty quibbles and forcing him to see a new, unavoidable immoral reality. The sirens wailing in the distance were merely a background hum to the profound, internal wreck occurring within Han Tae-woo. As his security detail finally swarmed the diner, neutralizing the remaining threat with the cold efficiency of consequentialist soldiers, Taewoo remained frozen on the linoleum floor. He looked down at his sharp dark suit, a garment that usually functioned as a symbol of his absolute ruinous control. It was now ruined, soaked through with a deep, visceral crimson. But the blood wasn't his. It belonged to the invisible girl, who still loomed over him, her broken bottle trembling but held firm. In this gruesome aftermath, Taewoo felt a sense of estrangement from his own worldview. He had lived his entire life by a utilitarian calculus, believing that every person had a price and every action was driven by pain or pleasure. To him, a waitress in a cheap diner was a petty quibble, in the grand design of the city, a handful of people who existed only to serve the interests of those with power. He knew for sure that in a moment of his desperate danger, an onlooker would always choose self-preservation. That was the moral logic of the world he built. Yet, as he looked at Zuri Imani, at the visible cut on her forehead and the way she had actively chosen to become the one sacrificed for the five or the many, what he already knew was proven fundamentally wrong. He was gripped by a shock and disbelief that went beyond the physical threat he had just escaped. He was facing a categorical reality that his money couldn't explain and his power couldn't command. This wasn't a verbal contract or a lottery of fate, it was a brave answer to a question he hadn't realized he was asking. His subordinates moved to usher him away, their stern-looking faces masks of controlled power, but Taewoo lingered. He reached out with a blood-stained handkerchief, not to wipe his own face, but to acknowledge the intrinsic quality of the woman standing before him. The familiar hierarchy of the city had turned strange. He realized that he was no longer the driver of the trolley car, he was a man who had been saved by the very person he had deemed invisible. As he was led to his car, the restlessness of reason began to stir within him. He was no longer a worse citizen of the moral world, he was a man haunted by a categorical debt that could not be settled with a checkbook. The shattered glass of the diner was nothing compared to the shattering of his own cynical assumptions. In the sterile, quiet luxury of his private estate, Han Tae-woo found himself unable to escape the restlessness of reason. He sat in a room that cost more than the diner itself, yet his thoughts remained fixed on the intrinsic quality of the blood staining his shirt. To a man like Tae-woo, everything was a matter of a consequentialist logic, every favor was a debt, and every debt had a price. He viewed the world through the lens of Jeremy Bentham's Sovereign Masters, believing that all human motivation could be reduced to a calculation of pain and pleasure. When Zuri was brought before him, still wearing a bandage over the visible cut on her forehead, Tae-woo did what he knew for sure was the correct procedure. He placed a thick, heavy envelope on the mahogany table between them, a handful of cash that represented more wealth than she would see in a decade of serving coffee. He presented it not as a gift, but as a fair procedure to settle the account. In his mind, this was the utilitarian solution, he had received a benefit, his life, and she would receive a benefit, financial security. The balance would be restored. But as Zuri looked at the envelope, the familiar flow of Tae-woo's world hit a wall. She didn't reach for the money. Instead, she looked at him with a sober intensity that made his controlled power feel suddenly fragile. She explained that she hadn't stepped in front of those men for a lottery or a payout. She hadn't been acting on a verbal contract or looking for a way to maximize her own utility. She had acted because it was the right thing to do, a categorical response to a moment of desperate need. By refusing the money, Zuri did something far more shocking than saving his life, she refused to be a petty quibble in his ledger. She estranged him from his own belief that everyone has a price. Tae-woo was left helpless in the face of her refusal, forced to realize that some debts are absolute and cannot be liquidated by calculating the general welfare. The money, which he thought would be the resting place for his conscience, sat untouched. For the first time, the Mafia boss had to confront the immoral work of a sacrifice that was beyond the reach of commerce. He had tried to buy her silence and her service, but he found that he couldn't buy her consent to be treated as a mere tool. The terrible wreck of his worldview was now complete, leaving him with a question he couldn't unthink: if her life couldn't be bought, what was it actually worth? In the wake of the refusal, the restlessness of reason spread like a contagion through the upper ranks of Han Tae-woo's organization. Within the glass-walled boardroom of his skyscraper, a sovereign space usually reserved for cold, strategic calculations, his inner circle gathered to voice a conscientious objection of a different sort. His lieutenants, men who lived by the consequentialist creed that the many must always outweigh the few, were deeply unsettled by Tae-woo's fixation on the waitress. She is just one person, his second-in-command argued, leaning across the table with a look of stern disbelief. To the organization, Zuri was a petty quibble, a statistical anomaly in a terrible wreck that should have been forgotten once the fair procedure of offering payment was completed. They argued from the standpoint of the general welfare of the syndicate. To elevate a commoner, to obsess over a debt to an outsider, was to weaken the reputation of the family. By their logic, her life had already been counted when she was offered the money. Since she refused to play by the verbal contract of the city, she no longer mattered. But Tae-woo, looking out over the city he once thought he owned, found himself unable to acquiesce to their skepticism. He realized that his men were stuck in the utilitarian trap he had just escaped. They saw a handful of a person, he saw a categorical immoral force that had shifted the steering wheel of his destiny. He looked at them and asked the riveting question that the philosopher would: is the moral worth of an act found in the consequences, or in the intrinsic quality of the soul that performs it? He disagreed with his advisors not out of sentiment, but out of a new way of seeing the world. He understood now that to treat Zuri as someone who doesn't matter would be to return to a resting place of ignorance. If he allowed her to remain invisible, he would be admitting that his own life was merely a product of pain and pleasure, rather than something with inherent dignity. The tension in the room was a clash of philosophies. While his lieutenants wanted to push the one off the bridge to save the five of their business interests, Taewoo was beginning to realize that the waitress with the broken bottle, was the only thing currently keeping his own humanity from hurtling into the abyss. He was no longer a worse citizen of his own conscience, he was a man prepared to risk his empire to honor a debt that his inner circle couldn't even see. Driven by the restlessness of reason, Han Tae-woo decided to step out of his sovereign skyscraper and into the neighborhood where Zuri Imani lived. For a man accustomed to the heat-controlled power of high-rise offices and armored convoys, this was an act of making the familiar strange. He traded his polished limousine for a modest, nondescript sedan, attempting to become an onlooker in a world he had previously only seen as a blur through a tinted window. As he walked down the cracked sidewalks of Zuri's district, the unquestioned setting of his life, the belief that the city was a machine built for his utility, began to dissolve. He found her not at the diner, but at a community center where she spent her resting hours volunteering. Seeing her in this new way, Taewoo realized that her act of bravery at the diner wasn't a split-second of fluke, it was a manifestation of her intrinsic quality. In this neighborhood, Zuri wasn't invisible. She was a pillar of a fragile collective welfare, a woman who treated every neighbor with the categorical respect of an equal. Taewoo watched her help an elderly woman navigate a flight of stairs, noting that she didn't do it for a verbal contract or a payout. She did it because she believed in the absolute moral requirement of human decency. The sights and sounds of the street, the hurtling noise of the subway, the desperate beauty of the street art, the scent of cheap food, became riveting to him. He was no longer looking at petty quibbles of urban decay, he was seeing a complex immoral work being performed by people that a utilitarian world had discarded. He realized that the general welfare he had always spoken of was a lie if it didn't include a handful of people like Zuri. Standing there, Taewoo felt the estrangement of his own soul. He had lived his life as if he were the only driver on the track, but Zuri's world showed him that he was merely one passenger among many. He saw that her life was rich with a purpose that his wealth could never buy. This transformation of perspective was beyond the reach of his previous skepticism. He wasn't just visiting a slum, he was visiting the source of the immoral force that had saved him. As he prepared to approach her, he knew that he couldn't just go back to his old ways. The restlessness had taken hold, and the familiar world of the Mafia boss was gone forever, replaced by a sober understanding that every person in this crowded track was an end in themselves, not a means to his profit. Returning to his world of steel and glass, Han Tae-woo found that he could no longer inhabit the unquestioned setting of his previous life. The restlessness of reason had moved beyond a mere intellectual curiosity, it had become an absolute moral requirement. He sat in his office, looking at reports of territory disputes and profit margins, but all he could see was the intrinsic quality of the blood on his white shirt and the determined face of the woman who had put her life on the line for nothing more than the sake of what is right. His advisors approached him with a fair procedure to handle the fallout of the diner ambush, a plan that involved eliminating the one responsible and returning to business as usual to protect the general welfare of the organization. They spoke of the inconsequentialist necessity of maintaining their reputation. But Taewoo realized that he was being asked to acquiesce to a system that treated human beings as disposable, petty quibbles. He saw now that ignoring Zuri Imani, leaving her to return to her life of a sovereign masters like rent and hunger while he sat in luxury, was not just a matter of ingratitude. It was categorically wrong. He realized that the immoral work of her sacrifice could not be settled by a checkbook or a lottery of chance. To accept his life as a gift from her and then turn his back on her world would be to violate a categorical imperative. It would be to treat her as a means to his survival rather than an end in herself. The skepticism of his lieutenants, who argued that she didn't matter because she was just one person, now sounded to him like the mentality that justifies any atrocity for the sake of the many. The clash within his soul reached its biggest moment of tension. If he chose to honor the categorical debt, he would have to dismantle the very controlled power that defined him. He would have to stop being the driver who turns the trolley toward the weakest person to save the status quo. He understood that self-knowledge is like lost innocence. Once you see the intrinsic value of a human life, you cannot unthink it. Tae-woo stood up, his expression sober and his disbelief replaced by a terrifying clarity. He was no longer a worse citizen of the moral world. He decided that the right thing to do was to fundamentally change the power structure of the city to protect the invisible people like Suri. This was his brave answer to the debt he owed, a debt that was beyond the reach of money and could only be paid through a total transformation of his own soul. The restlessness of reason that had begun in a blood-stained diner finally reached its peak, spilling out of the shadows and into the bright, unforgiving light of the city's public square. Han Tae-woo understood that for a transformation to be real, it could not remain a private resting place for his conscience. It had to become a shocking, public act that challenged the very unquestioned settings of the city's power structure. He knew that the general welfare of his empire was built on the invisibility of people like Suri, and to honor his categorical debt, he would have to pull back the curtain on that utilitarian lie. Tae-woo did not hold a press conference to offer more money or hollow apologies. Instead, he staged an event that estranged every politician, rival boss, and citizen from their comfortable assumptions. He stood before the city and announced the end of the invisible, a sweeping initiative that repurposed his organization's controlled power into a permanent social foundation for the marginalized. He turned his high-rise headquarters into a center of justice, ensuring that the handful of people who usually lived under the sovereign masters of hunger and rent were now the priority of the city's resources. He treated the debt to Suri not as a petty quibble to be settled, but as a moral work that demanded a total restructuring of how the city valued its weakest members. The city was left in a state of disbelief. His rivals viewed this as a terrible wreck of his business sense, a skepticism toward the rules of the game that had governed them for decades. But the people of Suri's world saw it as a brave answer to a system that had always treated them as means to an end. Tae-woo's act unsettled the power structure because it proved that an active choice for morality could outweigh the consequentialist logic of profit. He was no longer the driver of a runaway trolley, he was a man who had finally stepped off the tracks to acknowledge the intrinsic dignity of every human soul. As the sun set over a restless city, the familiar hierarchy had been permanently altered. Suri Imani stood in the crowd, no longer an onlooker or an invisible girl, but a symbol of the categorical power of a single right action. Tae-woo looked out at the city he had once sought to dominate and realized that self-knowledge is like lost innocence. He could never go back to being a worse citizen of humanity. The restlessness of reason had found its home not in a bank account, but in a community that finally saw itself. The story didn't end with a payout, but with the awakening of a city that realized, perhaps for the first time, that doing the right thing is not a calculation, but a requirement of the soul.